Welcome back to PCTR's PW Generous Justice Study, and what a journey it has been so far. I hope for you it's been a bit like a good roller coaster, and what I mean by that is perhaps it's been a little bit exhilarating, maybe a little scary, but maybe it has also left you kind of wanting more, wanting to understand more, wanting to go deeper, wanting to live more justly because this is God's plan and purpose for you. Last month, as we looked at chapter 3, we talked about how Jesus views justice. In fact, how Jesus embodies justice, that he lives in continuity with God's perspective and character of justice that extends back from the Old Testament and really all the way through the New. We see how God calls his followers to be a new community, to be a just community, a community where all are thriving and flourishing, a community where all are invited in, a community where the poor and the marginalized have their needs met and have literally a seat at the banquet table. It's really a beautiful, grand, compelling vision, but it's also a very challenging one that I think pushes us to really think, can I live this out? I think the temptation is to say, I can't do that. That's just too big. It's too much. It's too beautiful. And on one hand, that's true. We can't do it on our own, but just because we can't do it on our own and we need a whole community to live into it, doesn't mean we should ignore it and ignore the parts that we can do, and that as a community, as a church, we shouldn't continue to push to embody that kind of new community. But when something is so big and so challenging, I think one of the temptations that we all face is to try to minimize the challenge, to try to make it small enough so that we can actually handle it. Jesus addresses this tendency to try to minimize the call to justice in perhaps his ultimate parable about justice, the parable known as the Good Samaritan. Before Jesus tells the parable, an expert in the law has come up to him to try to justify his own behavior, perhaps justify his own lack of just living. And so he asks Jesus the question, who is my neighbor? Behind the question is this other question. Okay, Jesus, if we're taking care of our own, is that enough? If we're taking care of those who are like us, if we're taking care of those who are with us, is that enough? Who is our neighbor? And Jesus goes on to tell the shocking story of a Samaritan man, a religious and social outsider, as the one who lives justly, as he cares for a Jewish man. The Jewish man had been attacked by raiders and thrown in a ditch, and the Samaritan man, out of all the people, comes along, provides for his needs, takes care of his immediate problems, but then also gives money to the innkeeper to provide for his long-term recovery. This would have been a shocking story because of who the Samaritan is. But the shock to the original hearers would have come when Jesus flipped the original question on its head, and he asks the expert in the law, who was the one who acted like a neighbor to the man who was lying in the road? Jesus blows open the categories of who is worthy of our attention, of our work toward justice. He redefines who the neighbor is, breaking down religious class and social class and gender and race and creed, all of these categories that we use to justify perhaps not acting and living justly. And even as Jesus uses this parable to try to push against our tendency to narrow the scope of the call to justice, even as we hear it, I think that temptation still lingers. And actually that's why Keller in this chapter refers to really a compelling and challenging sermon from Jonathan Edwards, a preacher from the 18th century. In this sermon, Edwards addresses a series of objections that Christians usually use to try to justify not doing justice and not seeking to care for the needs of the poor. He addresses 4 objections. The first objection being, though they be needy, yet they are not in extremity. In other words, saying, well, they're not really destitute. They're not that hard off. It's not so bad. We don't need to do something for them. And in response, Edwards says, well, if we're to love our neighbor as ourselves, do we wait until we're destitute to intervene? Do we wait till things are so far gone to provide for our own needs? Of course not. And so it's not really good justification to wait till the other is destitute either. Second objection that Edwards addresses is people often say that they have nothing to spare. Well, in response, Edwards says, well, usually when people say they have nothing to spare, what they mean is they have nothing to spare without affecting the way they're living, without affecting their lifestyle. Certainly I have to say that I found this particular response of Edwards to be very challenging. And yet the call of Jesus, as he sacrificed himself, was one certainly not of seeking his own comfort, but seeking our own good. The third objection that Edwards raises is that people say, the poor person is of a very ill temper. He is an ungrateful spirit. In other words, he doesn't really appreciate what's being done for them, so why should we do anything to help? Edwards addresses this objection very easily by bringing us back to the reality of the gospel that none of us are particularly grateful. None of us are of upright character, and yet Jesus came and served our needs in our most desperate time. The last objection, well, maybe the most common. It's that people say the poor person has brought himself to poverty by his own fault. Certainly, we can understand that. There are times where it is their result of their choices and their responsibility of how they've ended up where they've ended up. And yet Keller has already addressed how complex the reality of poverty is, how many different forces and things work together, from the individual choice to policies and things that come down through society that all impact where a person lands. But Edwards's response to this objection, I think, was one of the things that stood out to me most from the chapter. He says that some people just do not have a natural faculty to manage their affairs. In other words, he's saying that some people just make series of bad choices over and over again and don't really even have the capability to do otherwise. Matter of fact, Edwards, according to Keller, says that we should consider this just like we should consider a lack of eyesight to be a natural impairment. Certainly it's appropriate to teach responsibility and teach people to learn to manage their affairs, but I'm really challenged by Edwards in this because I think I've put a lot of stock in that. That, yeah, everybody can be responsible. They should do better. And that sense of should, that burden that would put on people does allow me to get off the hook when they end up in a spot where they are struggling and they're hurting. And yet the call of Jesus is to continue, however they got there, to love them as I would love myself.